I remember last year's Halloween party as if it were yesterday. It was the kind of night that burned into your memory for all the wrong reasons. It's the stipend of the night that makes you feel sick just thinking about it. Even now, nearly a year later, I can still feel the dread crawling up my spine when I let my mind drift back to that night in 2023. Every time I catch a glimpse of a Halloween decoration or hear someone mention plans for this year's party, I shiver and the memories flood back. No matter how much I try, I can't shake the feeling that something unspeakable is coming. And the worst part, the next party is just days away. It all started innocently enough. My friend Jake had invited a bunch of us over to his place for a Halloween bash, and he always threw the best parties. Jake's house was out in the countryside, a huge old Victorian-style place that had been in his family for generations. The place had character, with creaky floors, tall windows, and enough old furniture to make it feel like you were walking into a different time. The perfect setting for a Halloween party. By the time I got there, the party was already in full swing. The front yard was decked out with fake cobwebs, skeletons, and jack-o'-lanterns, and the sound of music and laughter spilled out into the chilly October night. Everyone was dressed up in their costumes, some creative, some lazy, but the energy was high. It was just your typical Halloween night, or so I thought. I arrived with my girlfriend at the time, Erica, dressed as a zombie bride and groom. Cheesy, I know, but we had fun with it. As soon as we stepped inside, we were greeted by a mix of friends and unfamiliar faces. People milled around, talking, drinking, and laughing, just like any other party. But as I moved through the crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific, just this vague sense that the air in the house felt wrong, heavy even. Jake greeted us with his usual enthusiasm, dressed as some kind of undead pirate, and handed us drinks. "You guys are late. The haunted house tour is about to start," he said with a grin. Every year, Jake transformed the second floor of his house into a haunted maze for his Halloween party. He and a few of our friends would set up elaborate scares, hidden passages, and all sorts of props to freak people out. Normally, I loved that kind of thing, but that night, the idea of wandering around that old house didn't sit well with me. Still, we went along with it. A group of about 10 of us gathered at the base of the staircase, drinks in hand, laughing and making jokes to cut through the nervous energy. Jake dimmed the lights, adding to the atmosphere, and led the way. Erica grabbed my arm as we ascended the creaky stairs, whispering something about how creepy the house felt this year. I told her it was probably just the decorations and the spooky lighting, but deep down, I knew what she meant. There was something off about the house that night, something that felt wrong. The haunted maze started off as you'd expect. Creepy decorations, fake spider webs brushing against our faces, hidden speakers playing distant whispers and footsteps. Jake had outdone himself with the setup, and a few of our friends jumped out from behind corners, dressed as ghouls and monsters. But as we moved further into the maze, the atmosphere shifted. At first, I thought it was just part of the show. The air grew colder, the lights flickered more frequently, and the sound effects grew more distant, as if they were coming from far away. Erica clung to my arm tighter, her grip cold. Then something strange happened. We turned a corner, and the group ahead of us, Jake and a couple of others, were gone. The narrow hallway stretched on ahead of us, longer than I remembered, the walls narrowing in like a tunnel. "Where did they go?" Erica whispered, her voice shaky. I shrugged, trying to stay calm. "They probably just went ahead. Come on." We kept walking, but the further we went, the more disoriented I felt. The house wasn't that big, but it felt like we were walking in circles, or worse, like the house was changing around us. The hallways grew darker, the air thicker, almost suffocating. Then, we started hearing things. Soft footsteps behind us, the faint sound of whispering that didn't match the sound effects Jake had set up. It felt like we weren't alone, like something was watching us from the shadows. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but it had no signal. Erica's phone was the same, no bars, no connection. That's when the real panic set in. We hadn't seen anyone else from the group in what felt like hours, and the hallway we were in seemed endless. "Maybe we should turn back," Erica said, her voice barely a whisper. I could hear the fear in her tone, and I didn't blame her. My own heart was racing. We tried retracing our steps, but no matter which direction we went, the layout of the house didn't make sense anymore. Hallways that should have led back to the staircase only took us deeper into the maze. The air grew colder and the lights dimmer. Then we heard it, a soft, barely audible voice whispering our names. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. Erica gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but there was no one around us. No one ahead, no one behind. It was like the house itself was alive, calling to us, trying to lead us deeper into its labyrinth. Panic set in. We started running, no longer caring about the maze or the scares. We just wanted out. But no matter how fast we ran, or how many doors we opened, we couldn't find our way back. Every hallway led to another dead end. Every room looked the same as the last. Then the whispering stopped. For a moment there was silence, complete, suffocating silence. Erica and I stood there, breathless, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then we heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged along the floor. It was coming from behind us. We turned, and there, in the dim light at the end of the hallway, was a figure. Tall, hunched, and impossibly thin, it moved slowly toward us, its body dragging along the floor. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixed on us. I grabbed Erica's hand and ran. We didn't look back. The house seemed to shift and warp around us, but somehow we found our way back to the staircase. We practically fell down the stairs, crashing into the living room where the party was still going on, oblivious to what had just happened. Everyone else was laughing and drinking, completely unaware of what we had just seen. I turned to Erica, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave," she whispered, and I couldn't agree more. We left the party without saying goodbye, without looking back. As we drove away from Jake's house, the sense of dread that had gripped me all night began to lift, but it never fully went away. We didn't talk about what we saw, not really. I think we were both too scared to admit that it wasn't just part of the maze, that something else had been in that house with us. After that night, Eric and I broke up. I'm not saying it was because of what happened at the party, but I think that night changed something between us. We never really talked about it, but I know she felt it too, that sense that something was following us, even after we left the house. Now, a year later, Jake's throwing another Halloween party. He's been texting me, saying I need to come, that this year's maze is even better, more terrifying than the last. But I haven't responded. There's no way I'm going back to that house. Not after what happened last year. Some things aren't worth reliving. It was one of those eerie, windless nights that hung thick in the air, making every small sound echo through the empty streets. Halloween night. My neighborhood wasn't the bustling kind. Most houses were dark, with no decorations, and no pumpkins lit with flickering candles. People had either turned off their porch lights or weren't home, trying to avoid the few trick-or-treaters who might still be out. I hadn't planned to do much myself, maybe watch a horror movie or two and call it a night, but around 9 p.m., something made me look outside. I'd been sitting on the couch, lazily scrolling through my phone, when I heard what I thought were footsteps, slow, deliberate ones. I wasn't expecting anyone, and there hadn't been many kids around. I got up, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain slightly, just enough to peek out. That's when I saw him. A man stood on the corner of my street, right under the dim glow of the streetlight. He was alone, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked far too formal for Halloween, and in one hand he held a plastic pumpkin bucket, the kind kids use to collect candy. In his other hand, he held out a single piece of candy, as if waiting for someone to take it. But no one was around. The street was empty. I frowned. He wasn't part of any group, and wasn't walking door to door like most adults with kids on Halloween. He was just standing there, still as a statue, holding out candy to the empty air. My stomach tightened with unease. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I watched for a few more minutes, wondering what he was doing. He didn't move, just stood there, looking down the street like he was waiting. And then, from the far end of the block, a small figure appeared. A little girl, dressed in a princess costume, came walking up the street. I hadn't seen her before, and hadn't heard anyone else outside. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, and she was all alone. I pressed my face closer to the window, my heart pounding a little harder. Where were her parents? Why was she out so late by herself? The girl stopped a few feet away from the man. He crouched down, holding out the piece of candy to her. She hesitated for a moment, looking around as if searching for someone, but then she stepped forward and took the candy from his hand. They didn't speak, no words, no smiles, just a silent exchange. Then, without another glance, the girl turned and walked back down the street, disappearing into the darkness. I waited for a minute, expecting her to turn into one of the nearby houses, but she didn't. She just vanished. The man stood up slowly, dusting off his suit jacket, and started walking down the street. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Something was very wrong. My instincts screamed at me to lock the doors and stay inside, but I couldn't look away. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the front door as quietly as possible. I didn't want him to know I was there, watching. I followed him from a distance, staying in the shadows, trying to figure out what his deal was. He stopped again a few houses down, standing under another streetlight. Just like before, he extended his hand, offering candy to no one. I squinted, my heart racing. This time, there were no footsteps, no approaching figures. But then, from the shadows, another child appeared, a boy dressed as a superhero. He walked up to the man in the same way the girl had, with cautious curiosity, like something was drawing him in. The boy reached out and took the candy, just as silently as before, and walked away into the darkness. I watched him go, my mind spinning. Who were these kids? Where were they coming from? And why was this man just standing there, giving out candy to kids who seemed to appear out of thin air? I wanted to call out to the boy, to stop him and ask where he was going, but something in the pit of my stomach told me not to. It was as if an invisible force kept me rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as the boy disappeared into the night. The man continued walking, his pace slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. I followed him for what felt like hours, watching him stop at random spots along the street, always offering candy, always waiting for children who shouldn't have been there. Each time, a child would appear, sometimes a girl, sometimes a boy, each one taking the candy without a word, and each one vanishing just as quickly as they came. I wanted to leave, to run back to my house and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was happening, why this man was here, why these children were appearing like ghosts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man stopped at the last streetlight at the far end of the block. He turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly in the light. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were dark, sunken like he hadn't slept in years. He looked straight at me as if he had known I'd been there the whole time, watching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He smiled, a thin, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes, and tipped his hat to me, the way someone might in an old black and white movie. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness just like the children had. I stood there shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the spot where he'd vanished, but eventually, I forced myself to turn around and head back home. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That eerie smile, the children who came and went like they weren't real. The next day, I checked the local news, hoping for some explanation, but there was nothing. No reports of missing kids, and no strange sightings. It was as if nothing had happened. But I know what I saw. Those kids were real. And the man, whoever he was, he's still out there. Somewhere. And every Halloween, I wonder if he'll come back. Halloween had always been my favorite time of year. Something is thrilling about the spooky atmosphere, the decorations, the costumes, the feeling of playfully flirting with fear. But last Halloween changed all of that for me. I'll never forget the night that made me question everything. It started as a normal evening. I had just returned home from a small get-together with friends. It was close to midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet. I live on Oak Street, a place that's typically alive with kids in costumes, ringing doorbells for candy. But by the time I pulled up to my house, everyone had gone inside, leaving the street in an unsettling stillness. I parked my car and immediately noticed something odd. My porch light was off. I always leave it on when I go out, but there it was, completely dark. I brushed it off as a blown bulb, though a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The wind picked up, rustling the tall oak trees that surrounded my house and sending dry leaves skittering across the pavement. As I made my way to the front door, I felt it. That strange sensation of being watched. I paused, glancing over my shoulder, but the street was empty. just me and the distant glow of streetlights. Shaking my head, I quickly unlocked the door and stepped inside, locking it behind me. But the second I entered the house, I felt it. An unnatural stillness, like the house was holding its breath. It wasn't just the quiet, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I flicked on the lights, but the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My house is small, and every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the floorboards louder. I was about to head to the kitchen when I heard it. The sound of footsteps. At first I thought I imagined it, but then I heard it again. Soft, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from down the hallway. My heart raced as I stood frozen, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was an animal outside, or a loose floorboard creaking in the wind. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy vase from the table near the door, clutching it tightly as I made my way down the hallway. Every step felt like an eternity as I moved toward the sound. The footsteps stopped just as I reached the guest bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, expecting to see someone inside, but the room was empty. The curtains fluttered lightly from the open window, and for a moment I wondered if the wind had been playing tricks on me. But just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A whisper, "Get out." The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill through me. My blood turned cold as I backed out of the room, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stick around to investigate. I raced back down the hallway and into the living room, my hands trembling as I fumbled to lock the door again. For a moment, everything was still. Too still. My breathing was ragged, and I stood there, trying to collect myself, when something outside caught my eye. Through the front window, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my driveway. It was tall, much too tall to be a person, and its shape was wrong, distorted like a shadow stretched unnaturally long. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze piercing through the darkness. I stood frozen, staring out the window, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Suddenly, the figure began to move. Slowly, it glided toward the house, its form twisting and bending in impossible ways. Panic surged through me. I ran to the front door, checking the lock again as if that would keep whatever was out there from getting in. Then came the knock. It was a soft, rhythmic knock on the front door. Not frantic, but calm, almost as if whatever was outside was waiting for me to answer. I couldn't. The knocking stopped. Silence settled over the house again, thicker this time, like the air was pressing down on me. I stood there, heart racing, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. But when I looked through the peephole, the street was empty. The figure was gone. Cautiously stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. My street was as quiet as ever, the only sound coming from the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. But as I looked down at my driveway, I saw it. A single footprint was larger than any human footprint I'd ever seen, and its shape was wrong, like it had been made by something that didn't belong in this world. I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That was the moment I knew. Whatever had been at my house that night wasn't something I could explain away. I called the police after that, but they found nothing, just the strange footprint and the eerie stillness of the night. I haven't seen the figure since, but every Halloween, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there watching, waiting, and every Halloween, I wonder if it will come back.